Okay, thanks for that. I have another wheel to share. It's a little bit differently organized. Okay, so thinking about those four kind of developments in the cycle of the stereotype, prejudice, discrimination, and rationalization and self-fulfilling prophecy. And we were just talking about how we can intervene in that cycle at different points. We also have kind of different levels of, like different contexts in which we can intervene. And this is kind of like, it's been described to me before as Anishinaabe family tree. But I also kind of see it as, these are kind of different levels of our relationships. And in understanding Indigenous knowledge and worldview, everything is about relationships, because everyone is related and everything is alive, everyone is related. So if we think about kind of our internal, our inner space, if you will, as Willie Ermine describes it. He says we have an inner space that is as large as outer space. We have the level of the self. And so we can be, at that moment when we're internalizing the stereotype, when we encounter the stereotype, the problem is when we first learn a lot of these stereotypes, they're naturalized. They're like assumed to be common sense. It's the way of the world. We often encounter them as truths, as realities you wouldn't even think to question, because that's the way, that's the true nature of Indigenous being. That's who they are. That's what they're like. So it's very hard to do this, but we are capable of doing it, and we're doing it right now. We're critically thinking about these notions and ideas. So internalization of bias and stereotype is one level at which we can do this work of countering. So we're intervening at the level of self. We're intervening at prejudicial developments, the rationalization phase. Do we ever stop ourselves by, maybe we think, well, we're rationalizing a stereotype. Maybe if we become very good at that, this self-conscious, critical, meta-critical thought, when we find ourselves reading a piece in The Sun or something like that, and we say, what's going on here? They're rationalizing a certain action against Indigenous people. We can question that and look for other contexts. Family is a big one. I like to describe like the Thanksgiving dinner, and you're with that extended family, and inevitably someone's going to bring up some sort of ridiculous racist comment, and how do you engage, right? It's a big question, but that's another level where we do this work. If someone says something and we say, hey, where do you get that idea from? What are you talking about? This could be our own children, how we talk to our kids about these notions. It can be the elder generation, and how do we respond when they're sharing their wisdom about certain things. It's different for everyone, but this is another level where those conversations can be had and should be had if we're ever going to see any sort of change in the way that these stereotypes circulate and how prejudices are formed and enacted as discrimination. Community level as well. And we're seeing a lot of work right now going on in the community to attempt to bring awareness to certain issues. And this is another way to kind of counter certain ideas and stereotypes. The danger, of course, is it also in some ways can help reinforce certain stereotypes. So we do have to do our work to, in our own ways, with our own relationships, in the best way we can, to make sure that some of those stereotypes aren't being replicated. And so then that's when we kind of ask, who has the right to do these kinds of things in certain circumstances? And not every struggle is ours to take up, right? And so when we're looking at our different set of relationships, like I wouldn't presume to speak to your family about some issue, but that's where you can have a voice. And then in our communities, we are members of multiple communities. So maybe, it's one person's place to criticize the actions of elected chiefs about something. But someone else should be looking at a different community when they're making their kind of interventions in these stereotypes. It kind of depends what our relations are and so forth. Then we're all circumscribed by the broad notion of our societal relationships. And I would say what kind of fits in this outer ring or outer category is some of that national legislation and policy that utilizes some of those stereotypes about Aboriginal people to enact a certain kind of power over. We can be critiquing that. We can be looking into what our state representing us is saying is the right way to act toward Indigenous people. And we can start to look at that and question that. So much of the paternalism of Canada's Indian Act, it relies upon a stereotype of Indians as childlike and incapable of running their own affairs. And we can see this stereotype coming up quite a lot with the financial management on a lot of First Nations communities, which, first of all, I have to get this in there, they are run by Indian Act government models, which is an imposed system of governance, which is not our traditional governance. So when Ottawa or the media critique the way that certain chiefs are running certain communities, they're doing so under this imposed colonial government model. So really, are they not critiquing their own system of government they imposed upon us? And secondly, there's a little bit of hypocrisy there too. When we look at certain corruption in different government models, we can look at financial mismanagement in any number of other non-Indigenous places. What's unique about First Nations governance being critiqued in this way is that it's ascribed to the culture, right? It's rationalized as it's the culture. They're not ready to run their own affairs. It's not about the kinds of things we would say if there's a conflict of interest in in the way the mayor is running the city, or the way that certain provincially hired and trusted ministers ran their portfolios. No one ever says, well, that's a white problem. But when it's Ottawapiskat, then it's a cultural problem. They can't run their own affairs. We need to impose third-party management, etc. What I've liked is this hashtag of Ottawapiskat, where we're looking at the same kinds of issues, but at the federal government and other governments. So, these are the kinds of interventions, like that's a very clever way to get people to invert that critique. These are the kinds of interventions we can make at that societal relationship level, okay? And as educators, we have a great opportunity to engage in these kinds of conversations, in this kind of development of critical thinking among the people that we work with and in our own work. One of the things that this requires, though, is for us to get really critical about the sources that we use, that we engage with, because there is no perfect source out there. And one thing I kind of learned in trying to amass together sources to put together for teachers and for educators and so forth, is that you start to see there is no one perfect source. People say, what's the one book I should read? Or what is the one lesson plan that changes everything? Well, there isn't, right? There isn't just one. And And every one has some good things and some bad things. It has some things you can improve upon or so forth. So we have to become really good at seeing what that is in the work that we do. OISE has put together a website called Deepening Knowledge. And within that website, beside all the other resources that are there, there's also a section that helps you to identify the bias in a source and to become very critical about what biases are operating, what stereotypes are operating, what questions should we ask of any source that we're about to use. And we're never going to find one, I don't think, that doesn't have at least some hints of some stereotype operating within it. But it'll be very good and useful for many other things. We just have to, as we encounter these different sources and as we use them in our own work, be aware of what they're good at doing and what they're not good at doing, and supplement that with something that does that part well. So we're never going to find one perfect thing, but we can find all kinds of supplementary material. We can introduce that concept of critical notions and thought, even with some of our youngest learners. They can be really good at pointing out the limits of certain things. And I'll give an example. I used to work for, ironically enough, the Department of Indian Affairs. And one of my responsibilities was doing school visits, because the Indian Affairs Department would get asked to send someone to teach the kids about Indigenous issues or something like that. They didn't know where to go, so they went to the Department of Indian Affairs. They had enough requests that I think it became something they had to do. And so as a member of the communications department, I was asked one summer to be putting these things together. And I went in with a group of grade 3s, so they're 7 and 8 years old. And I was asked what I was asked to do is to talk about the Constitution and how there are 3 recognized Aboriginal groups. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit. Describe some of the cultural contributions of each of these 3 groups to the nature of Canada, to the fabric of Canada. It's a very positive lesson to give youth, right? So it was focusing on positive contributions, things that you might not think about as being Indigenous, like corn, pain relief, willow bark as a form of pain relief. These kinds of inventions, if you will, that came from Indigenous peoples. So, after about 45 minutes of sharing the culture, sharing positive contributions, I open it up to questions from the kids. And usually, I told a creation story, and the kids would ask questions about the creation story, like, how many turtle backs were there? But in this case, the first question that came from the 8-year-old was, if you said First Nations is the preferred term, and that Indian is on the way out, why do you work at the Department of Indian Affairs? And so there you go. From the very youngest age, they can point out these kinds of problems with these overgeneralizations and stereotypes. So there's a lot of hope, really, I think, in our youth, and we can certainly help provide a model and a path for them to follow.